There you go.
Okay,
Perfect.
there
So,
we go.
yeah. So I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. Hopefully familiar, but we're part of NC State University, and our mission is to bring in, test, evaluate, introduce plants to the nursery industry and to the public uh, to improve landscapes and provide opportunities for North Carolina and beyond nurseries and landscapers and homeowners. So sometimes people ask, why aren't we more involved with native plant conservation, and why aren't we doing more with native plants? And the truth is, we do a lot with native plants if they're good garden plants. We don't do native plant conservation because NC Botanic Garden's right down the road and they do such a fantastic job. And that's not our mission. But the whole idea of invasives is an important one. And we spend a lot of time out in the field, both in the US, but even more so abroad, collecting plants for evaluation, for breeding purposes, to bring the genetics back. So, this is something that I've thought about, but then several years ago, I guess pre-COVID, uh, I was asked to speak to the North Carolina Invasives Council, their annual meeting, at which that's a touchy subject for us sometimes. So I went in and I really started thinking about invasives and about how we deal with them and about how we talk about them. And the first question is always, what is an invasive? Here is officially in the US, an exotic species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. That's a pretty broad uh, topic. Obviously, people worst invasive. We cause lots of harm, especially to human health. Um, Interestingly, a native plant in the UK is defined as a plant that's been growing there for 500 years. They have there's been so much in and out and people there that basically have to go back to uh you know the the Romans and the Celts for them to decide it's when it's a native, which I find interesting. I tend to go a little bit more internal. This is more of uh my view is talking about a plant that invades a functioning natural ecosystem, displacing natives and causing harm once population equilibrium is reached. That that definition, I use that because so much of where we look at natives, and look at invasives, and we'll talk about that, are not functioning ecosystems. So we have thrown these ecosystems out of whack, and then we blame plants for invading them when it's really the fact that we've thrown these ecosystems out of whack. But in either one of those definitions, we talk about harm, but who is it who gets to define what that harm is? It's, nebulous. And I just want to start from the beginning. Introduced and invasive are not synonyms. Plants can be introduced, can be exotic, and not be invasive. Sometimes these things get mixed up. Neither is a garden thug an invasive plant. Uh, Something that spreads rapidly in a garden may not be invasive because it does not escape and get into ecosystems. It just takes over in our garden. And a lot of times people have a hard time seeing the difference between their garden and the natural world. So if it's a bad in their garden, they think it's bad everywhere, but that's certainly not the case. So what is a native plant? Anybody want to go out there? What is native?
Oh, come on.
My definition would be a plant that was here before European settlement.
Before European settlement.
Right.
So what you mean is it was already here when white people saw it.
Yes. Yeah. When they
Right. So it's
got off
all
the boat from Europe, the first people here,
so
it
once
was already here.
white people saw it, it became native. So
Okay.
that is what we're talking about, right? That is how we define
Yes.
it. Is when the important people got here and saw it, then it became native. It's a little of a Eurocentric attitude that we have. But what about plants that were here before we got here? Talk about ginkgo. Is ginkgo native?
It was before they died out.
It was. It was here a long time ago before we got here. This is native one. Pistachio is native here. Dawn redwood is native here, depending on your time frame. So nativity is not just a location, but it's also a point in time. Is Magnolia grandiflora native to central North Carolina? We'll get to that. What do you think about that? Where is Southern Magnolia native to? But I want to go back a step before we got here, before Europeans got here. What was the U.S. like? So, and we're talking geologic time. People tend to think in these very, very short time frames. But let's look at more geologic time. So the last glacial maximum was 22,000 years ago. And, during that time, we were, North Carolina, much of North Carolina was looking at northern coniferous forests, open boreal woodland and taiga-like woodland, close to tundra type woodlands. So that's what was native here. During that period, can y'all see my pointer? My pointer visible? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
So during that time, when the glaciers came down, a lot of plants were pushed south. And actually, at the terminus of the Appalachian Mountains in Alabama, there's a tremendous number of unusual plants that have much more cold hardiness than you would expect. And that is because they had been pushed down by natural forces. So since those had been pushed down from the mountains during the glaciation, are those actually native farther north? What does that mean? So, say 15 to 25,000 BC, which we're now thinking is closer to 15,000 than 25,000. People came from Asia, crossed the Bering Strait, which I don't know why in my childhood, when they talk about the Bering Strait and this land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, I imagined this, 4-foot wide footpath across the ocean, not that it was, this huge landmass. And people came in and they went down south towards Mexico and then up along the Gulf Coast and into the southeast and mid-Atlantic. And during that period, we know during the Paleo-Indian period that they regularly burned the Piedmont and the coastal plains, especially in valleys in the mountains, were regularly burned intentionally by indigenous peoples to keep the forests open, to promote the production of grasses and herbaceous material for deer to feed on. We know that happened. So 10,000 years ago, people were altering the land to suit their needs. You know, you read old journals of exploration in the New World, and they talk about riding 4 abreast through the forest. You know, when we think of a native, undisturbed eastern forest, do we think of somewhere that you can ride a horse through, much less 4 people? No, we think of a very congested forest, not these wide open spaced trees that were here when Europeans arrived here and saw them. And the shift between that was we cut everything down and we farmed it. Basically, all of the eastern US was logged and farmed. Now, people talk about old growth forests here, and I've been to more old growth forests where I look at the trees and say, these trees are 50 to 75 years old. They're not old growth. They're just old growth because we don't have any old forests anymore. There are a few small spots of truly old growth forest, but almost everything we have in the eastern US is secondary or even more often tertiary growth. It is not old growth. So I mentioned Southern Magnolia as a native. We all know. I grew up in South Central Virginia. There are more things named, you know, Magnolia this and Magnolia that, and I grew up thinking it was native to Virginia. But the truth is, this is what we know of as its original nativity. Does that look like what you think of as uh, the native range of Southern Magnolia? Now the USDA, and this color means native. So now it is native all the way up to Pennsylvania, if you consider that native. But when Europeans got here, it was barely into North Carolina, and certainly not up into Tennessee and Kentucky. But it was basically a coastal plain plant. But we have moved it because we've planted it in other areas. Our climate has warmed, and so it is more adaptable as it goes farther north. There's been some of that movement is natural, but a lot of it is not natural. But you can find it in the woodlands all through eastern Virginia. So, is it native to eastern Virginia? Would it have been there if we hadn't planted it in gardens and it escaped those gardens? Is it invasive? Maybe it's not a native and it's an invasive plant in Virginia because it's not from there when Europeans got here and it has escaped our gardens. So is it a bad thing? You know, I don't know. There's other things we need to think about when we talk about the why of these plants being here. You know, in the 1500s, this was trade routes. You know, it was not really what we have going on right now. Now, it's more like this. All those red lines are trade routes. We are moving everywhere. So the idea of saying we are going to keep out the bad plants, we're going to exclude everything, is just not realistic. You can like that, you can dislike that, but it's the truth. You know, when we look back in our history, you know, in the eastern part of the US, at least 50% of the land was in a natural state. 2000, less than 20%. This is you know, where we have, I mean, this would be, if this were more of a satellite picture, you would look at this and say, wow, look how green it is. Look at all the forests. But this kind of gives you a sense of how fragmented that is. You know, yeah, there's a lot of green, but if you're, you know, in one of these little green areas that's wooded and you're an animal or something, how do you move about between them? So we've got this, you know, human human changes that we've been putting on for the last 10,000, you know, 12,000 years. We've got increased globalization and movement of plants and people and products. We've got habitat fragmentation. You know, even in our forest lands that we are keeping, you know, parklands and forest lands, we drive all through that, we log it, we put in power lines, and we fragment it. So all this is to say that when we talk about an invasive plant that escapes and gets whatever your definition is, it's a plant that escapes. What we are talking about is a symptom. All these other pieces are underlying clauses. And as we know, we should know, treating the symptoms is usually not effective, and it's usually very difficult to do, or to do where it makes any real difference. You know, you can get the measles or chicken pox, and you can rub calamine lotion on all your itching, and you are alleviating some of the symptoms, but you're not doing anything for the underlying problem. So how do we deal with the underlying problem? We're not going to stop global trade. We might be able to do something about fragmentation. You know, I always really support land conservation groups. Those are the groups that I feel do more to save native plants than quite honestly, any native plant society, because they're not worried about this plant over this plant. They're looking at, let's conserve large areas of land, and that's where we have the best chance of really saving these plants. So when we look at some of the causation, one of the major causes, underlying causes for invasive species spread, or at least major correlations, don't want to say causation, correlations, is exotic species richness, is soil fertility. And that soil fertility issue is coming from our chem lawns and all these, you know, wanting to have emerald green lawns where we are over fertilizing our lawns, and it is lawns more than most anything else. We are just dumping fertilizer on that is not being used. It is running off. All that nitrogen just runs right off. You need a little bit to get that green grass, which maybe we should be looking at not having so much of that emerald green grass. And that is going into our waterways, into our wetlands. And if you go down into, you know, a wetland area, or a mesic area where water has run to, and you see all kinds of privet, and I'm not saying that privet is a good plant, and that we should be planting it, but we see all this privet there, we look at it and say, privet is bad, right? If you test the soil there, you will find out that it is unnaturally fertile. That's why that exotic is there. If the soil fertility in that area was normal, we wouldn't have so much of that privet in there. Now we might have some, but there's a reason why you go in some areas and it's just overloaded with non-natives, and then you go to another area and it's really not at all. There might be a few here and there, but not that way. So, but we don't deal with that. We just look at it and say, that plant, bad. We don't look at it and say, why are those plants there? So if we want to do something about it, let's get stricter non-point source pollution regulations and start really looking at these nutrient inputs. They are a real problem. So going back, what is the reality is? We've got some severe anthropogenic disturbance. We've been messing with things. We've got fragmented natural areas. We've got a distorted sense of history and the legacy of change, you know, over time. Remember, geologic time and our time are different things. And there is a lot of bad information out there. There's so much bad information. It is information that is not science-based. It is information that's coming for well-minded, but really agenda-driven people, and a lot of it's just coming from sources that don't know what they're talking about. You know, introduced species, they're not an apocalyptic threat to biodiversity. That's just not a something that's backed by data. We know that in areas where there are more exotics, in a lot of cases, there is more native species diversity. But to give you an example of bad information, have any of y'all heard that Nandina is killing birds?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, Nandina is
Yes.
killing birds. They're terrible. They kill birds.
Yeah, too bad it's not true.
It's not true. But for 30
Cedar
years,
waxwings.
30 years, I have been doing this professionally. And one of the things that I can tell you is if you want berries in the winter, plant some Nandina because the birds won't eat the berries. Now, there were cedar waxwings that were found in Decatur, Georgia, that had died. When they cut their stomachs open, they had berries, Nandina berries in them. The Nandina had killed those birds. I am not saying it didn't. The Nandina killed those birds. So yes, it is true. Nandina kills birds. I went through and started reading the articles, just newspaper articles. And you read through about how all the cedar waxwings were killed and all this stuff. You get to the bottom, all the articles I read, near the bottom paragraph, where nobody ever reads through that long anymore. You know, you get these things from the city horticulturists, arborists, you know, whoever their head of parks and recreation. Nandina is in probably 1 out of every 2 yards in Decatur and Atlanta. It's prolific. So we know cedar waxwings are gorge feeders. They will just, once they start feeding on something, they will just feed until they can't eat anymore. When they came through Decatur, when they were migrating through and they need to eat, all there was to eat was Nandina. If people had planted more hollies and other berry producing plants, they would have eaten those first. I can watch the cedar waxwings come through the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. When I lived in Norfolk, Virginia, the Norfolk Botanic Garden, they would come through and strip the hollies and not touch Nandina ever. So yes, Nandina will kill those cedar waxwings, but it's because there's nothing else. Lack of diversity. That diversity doesn't matter whether it's native or non-native. It needs more diversity. The cedar waxwings are perfectly happy eating Asian hollies, and they do just fine if they eat Asian hollies or hybrid hollies. It does not affect them. But now you look at what you see online, things like the berries of Nandina domestica are beloved by other birds such as robins and mockingbirds, indicating the potential toxicity of these birds if they're consumed during feed unavailability. That's the key, during feed unavailability, because there's not more of them. I looked in a shockingly peer-reviewed journal where they talked about how much these birds, such as mockingbirds, will eat Nandina. And I went and looked at one of the, I was looking at their references. And so one of these I'm looking, I said Floridata. And if you Google plants, like y'all probably do, you probably see Floridata every now and then. I've never used it. So I went and looked at it. Floridata is a guy named Jack, who's a gardener. And he says that birds, you shouldn't plant Nandina because birds love to eat them and it'll kill them. Jack is just some guy who's decided that. He probably read these things from Decatur, and so then he says that, and now it's being used as a reference for something that should be known better, but by a peer-reviewed journal by somebody who has a real agenda. You know, you got to be careful where this information comes from all the time.
Hey, my apron is back.
So we get into the insects and natives, arthropods. I've looked and looked and looked. In good peer-reviewed research, there is no good research showing natives are better for pollinators than non-natives. Size and shape of flower. Now, there are some plants that have a very close relationship with a specific insect that, in that case, that native plant and that insect do need to be together. There's no good research showing that non-natives are better for pollinators than natives, but it's size and shape of the flower, not, it has nothing to do with where those plants came from. You know, we don't have to eat plants that are from near us. Our animals don't need to eat plants, you know, our pets and our domesticated animals don't need to eat plants that come from where they originate. We manage to eat plants that come from the old world, the new world, Asia, Africa, South America, and we do fine. But somehow we say that insects can't do that.
We got too many plates.
I was gonna use that. Oh, fine.
Is there any way to turn the volume off on if I'm happy, people can speak to me, but please mute.
I think the host can silence everybody.
Yeah, Mark, especially the iPad 3 is the one that could, if you could mute, mute them. iPad 3.
While I'm in full screen, I can't. Are you not the host as well?
Let me, I don't think so. Let me see if I can do it. I think I just.
Oh, wait, maybe I can do this.
Okay.
I can do it, but
Okay. No, it's not letting me.
yep. All right. I muted everybody. You can unmute yourself to ask a question and then remute. There's no good research that says native species support more native arthropods. It's just not the case. You know, when you talk about, well, you know, how many of our birds and some of our butterflies, like monarchs, you know, migrate to completely different areas or widespread, and we think that only the ones around us are going to support those. Not the case. A big one recently is that Lepidoptera, caterpillars, which are important for feeding birds, that those have now become the most important thing. We got to feed those caterpillars so we can feed the birds when they're nesting, right? And that is based on a lot of it on some research where there was comparison between native and non-native plants and how many Lepidoptera they support. With the top outstanding one being oaks. So I want you to read this and understand what it says, because this is that research. This is quote from some of that research. Not the stuff from that research, but the research itself. All plant genera with ornamental species that evolved in Europe, South America, or Asia, and with no native representatives in the mid-Atlantic region were labeled as introduced. So think Nandina or what are some other things that have, you know, Mahonia.
Autumn olives.
Autumn olives. All genera comprised of native species with geographic distributions in the Middle Atlantic region were native, 103 genera. Even if that genus contained one or more species that had been imported for use from Europe or Asia. So understand that we are comparing plants that have no native counterparts in the Mid-Atlantic region, and those are non-native. And the native is plants which have a native plant in the Mid-Atlantic region, but also all the other species, you know, that includes all other species. And so what was done in this research, comparing these two things, was go in and do a literature search to look for all the times those genera were said to be fed on or to host Lepidoptera caterpillars. So, and oaks came out on top. Now, oaks range from South America, all across North America, across Europe, into the Middle East, North Africa, all through Asia, down into Malaysia. It's one of the most widespread tree species. And everywhere it grows, it is important tree species. It is used for acorns as food for wildlife, and, you know, pigs in Spain and turkeys in the US. It is used as a lumber tree in many of the areas where it grows. It's used for corks. It is used everywhere. So you would think there'd probably be a lot of people looking at it and looking at what feeds on it. Right? That just makes sense. So there we go. So we're comparing autumn olive to Quercus. You know, these incredibly widespread genera with these often very narrowly distributed genera. To me, that is comparing apples and oranges. It's not comparing apples and apples. If they had said introduced and then native, only plants that were native to that region, or only looked at the literature search for those native ones and not included everything else, that might be a little bit more even. But from this, we're told that we should plant only oaks. So when you look at that, though, in the top 20 was Pyrus, pear. So if the research says oaks are great, so you should be planting white oaks, because oaks all around the world support Lepidoptera, so you should plant white oaks, which is what we're often told in the popular press stuff that came out of that research. One of the best 20 trees you can plant is a Bradford pear, right? Based on this research and how it is presented, Bradford pears are great. We shouldn't be cutting them all down. Now, obviously, that's not the truth, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek. But what I'm saying is the research was not very well put to get designed, and then the results that are coming out of that are twisted for an agenda. Just like you could twist it and say that that Bradford pear is one of the best 20 trees to support native Lepidoptera. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. It's even well-meaning good people can sometimes have a bit more of an agenda than you like and twist the research. We also see other research. Red leaves remove chlorophyll from the leaf and load it with anthocyanins, which just happen to be feeding deterrents. That was in another peer-reviewed journal. That is crazy. If you know anything about the chemistry and phytobiology, you know that that's not true. Anthocyanins and chlorophyll are in two entirely separate parts of the leaf cells. Anthocyanins are in cell vacuoles. Chlorophyll is in the chloroplast class. So when you read this, you can say this is just junk science, because this person doesn't know what they're talking about. Red leaves do not remove chlorophyll. We also hear that non-natives have no environmental value or provide ecosystem services. And I would say that's not true. As garden use of plants in the Apiaceae family have grown, and I'm talking non-native ones, fennel and as Queen Anne's lace has spread, and these other Apiaceae plants, black swallowtail numbers have rebounded from really low numbers. There's a study in Puerto Rico where there were these degraded forests from strip mining, and they kept trying to reforest them with native species. They couldn't do it. They finally went to and reforested with about 80% non-native plants that they knew would grow in these really denuded sites, and 20% native species. Those forests grew, and now they're just past the 50-50 point naturally, 50% native, 50% non-native. If you draw that hard line about natives and non-natives and say, no, they shouldn't have planted any non-natives there, they'd still have these strip mine sites with nothing growing there. It took these non-native plants to remove the heavy metals and some of the Fabaceae, the beans, adding nitrogen into the soil and building that soil up. So these have ecosystem services. We talk about honeybees and the ecosystem services they have. Those are not native. In fact, we are exporting. We brought honeybees here. They now get diseases that have been re-exported back to where they're native and are killing bees in their native habitats. We also have this idea that native is a sign of evolutionary fitness. We say natives are better adapted because they evolved here, which has two problems to it. One, it's a bad understanding of evolution. Evolution is not that things have whatever is best for them to survive. It's that they will survive in the area as well or better than other things. But some of the past adaptations, some other things that don't actually hurt them can still be in their DNA, in their genetics. That's why plants that were 10,000 years ago pushed down into Alabama are still cold hardy, because it doesn't hurt the plant to be adapted for cold. It just needed to be adapted for heat as well. So when we move them back up into gardens or they go north, they can tolerate the cold. That's because it isn't because they evolved that cold tolerance where they are in Atlanta now. It's that they didn't lose it when they were moved there. It also, when we say that natives are better adapted because of evolutionary fitness, we're not taking into account that we have no native soils here in the East. None of our soils are native. It has all been logged, farmed, and if we're living anywhere near it, it's been scraped. And we are mostly not on soil at all in much of the East. We're on subsoil. So no plants have not evolved to grow on that kind of soil, and especially not our native ones. But then we say that natives are better adapted, but then exotics are too aggressive. Yes, some are, but you put the wrong native in some spots and it's too aggressive. So we have to think about what our ecosystems really are now. I watched this road construction. This was out towards the west of the state. They were doing a road and railroad tracks, and they literally blasted the side of the mountain with explosives, went through back and forth over it, dumped gravel, put down asphalt, and what popped up was a Paulownia, a princess tree. And I was with somebody that say, look at that. There is a terrible plant. It'll grow even in this. And I looked around and I thought, wait a second. We've just blown apart a mountain and done all this, and somehow that plant that is managing to survive is the culprit. That's the bad thing in this situation, is this plant. Which is just crazy, that we blame the Paulownia for that. When I gave this talk to the NC North Carolina Invasives Council, I walked around. Everybody had their little trifolds out, their little booths out, all the different groups, and they all had their top 10 worst invasives. And Paulownia was probably on 80% of their lists. And it made me wonder, do any of these people actually go anywhere that there are native, where there are natural systems? Because Polonia will grow in a crack in a sidewalk. It'll blow in the rubble of a blown out mountainside. It'll grow alongside a road where we spray and mow and bush hog, but it does not grow in a woodland. It is a quick successional plant. It is the equivalent of a lawn, an annual lawn weed that pops up and does its thing, sets a lot of seed, and then dies out. That's the reason it grows so quick. It has huge leaves, it has big showy flowers, so you can see it when you're going 70 miles an hour down the interstate and you look at it and say, oh my gosh, not native, that's a terrible plant. But if you go 10 feet into the woods, you do not see Polonia growing there because it's shade intolerant. It will not grow there. You don't see it growing through fields. You don't find a place like that. You find it in continually disturbed ecosystems, marginal and disturbed ecosystems. So is it really a problem with this plant? Or is it that we're having a problem looking at where it is growing and not recognizing it for a place that we are constantly disturbing? It's actually a great plant. This is in North Carolina. There's somebody who uses it, has a whole field of them. They do not escape because the rest of the fields around there are farmed. That seed isn't going away from there. And the wood untreated lasts longer than red cedar and is almost as light as balsa wood. It's amazing wood. But we've gotten so that we hate it so much that we won't even look at its benefits. So what do we do? I'm going out collecting plants. What do I do? There's a great tool that's out that was developed by the late Sarah Reichert at University of Washington. Got 93% accuracy with 19 questions. So I wanted to test this. I took a plant that I knew is a problem in places, rubus. This is Rubus rolfii. This is ground covering black raspberry bramble from Taiwan. So I wanted to look at this. So start the 19 questions. Has the species become naturalized where it is not native? No. Is it noted as being the species noted as being invasive elsewhere in the world? No. Is the species noticed as being invasive elsewhere in the US or world, in a similar climate? No. Are other species of the same genus invasive in other areas with similar climate? Yes. So we've got 1 point there. Is the species found predominantly in a climate that matches those with the region of introduction? Yes. It grows in Taiwan, and which matches up with us very well at the elevations where that rubus grows. Does it displace native plants in areas where it has invaded? No. Is the plant noticed as being highly flammable? See, this is for the whole country. So where fire is a big issue, that's in here too. So we got another 2. So that puts us at 3 points total. Is the plant a health risk? No. Does it produce impenetrable thickets? Now, other rubus, the answer would be yes, but this is a ground cover one, so it does not. Does it reproduce vegetatively via root sprouts? Yes. So we're up to 4 points. Are fragments capable of producing new plants? Yes. Does it produce viable seed? It generally, in most cases, does not, but yes, it can. So we gave it a 1. Does it produce copious viable seed each year? Yeah, I didn't know how to answer this, so I said yes. Does it produce seeds that germinate quickly? No. Does it have a short juvenile period? Does it form seed in 3 years or 5 years? This is kind of somewhere in between. Say yes. So we're up to 8. Does it have a long flowering period? No. Are the plant propagules dispersed by mammals? I know our interns like to eat the fruit, so I'm going to say yes. Are they dispersed via wind? No, it's a little orange raspberry. Is it dispersed via agriculture? No. So we're up to 9, and that's it. And 1 to 10 is acceptable. 93% accuracy, say this is acceptable. 11 to 13 needs more information. 14 to 23, reject. We use this in the field when we're collecting. A lot of it is intuitive, and before I got this tool, I don't know how many years ago. I still kind of in my gut knew some of these things, but actually going through this is a great exercise that we use when we're in the field and we're thinking about collecting something. I have left more amazing plants in the wild than I've brought back because I was concerned that they may not be well behaved when they get here. So we use things like that, but also use real data. Invaders do not represent an extinction threat in most environments. We spend billions on eradications that have been terribly ineffective. We would do more to support wildlife, arthropods and caterpillars, if we reduced planting that exotic turf grass, which is everywhere. And we'll do more to support wildlife if we encourage diversity in horticultural situations. And I need to go back and frame this and say, I am talking about horticultural situations. I'm talking about gardens and cityscapes and roadsides. I am not talking about natural areas. You should not be planting exotic things at Umstead Park or in, the Great Smoky Mountains or wherever. No, you should not. Those are natural areas. What we should do is conserve them and not slice them up into little pieces. But keep in mind that most plants now are in horticultural situations. Accept that there are positives to non-natives. Even if you don't want to plant them, be realistic. There are positives and negatives to most everything. There's a study done in Pennsylvania where the shrubby honeysuckles are a terrible weed up north. But where they have more of those non-native honeysuckles, they have more native bird species, and the seed of native berry-producing plants is highest where those exotics are most abundant. That's because there are tons of birds feeding on that non-native. That's how yes, that is a bad thing that it's spreading all over, but those native berry-producing plants are being dispersed more than they are where there aren't the exotics. So those exotics are doing something. Introduction of non-natives, rather than reducing the number of species in a region, almost all places and times, it has increased the number of species in a region. It has increased the number of insects and birds and plant species in there. This is from way back 2012. We had the holly, the honey at from the J.C. Raulston Arboretum analyzed for what plants were in it. And it was 3 pages long. And at the end, it said that there was a bunch of pollen that they couldn't even identify. But if you look through here, and again, this is just 1 page, there's some that are big. There's, maples, 10.5% of the pollen was from maple. And it was not all from red maple. It was from Japanese maples and other species of maples. But you go through and there's some native, some not native things. Crepe myrtle, 2.5%. We say crepe myrtles are no good for honey. 2.5%. Privet. The insects love privet. That's why it makes so much fruit. You go through and some of this is native, some of it's not. Since it's coming from the Arboretum, we know that even where there is something that's native, there's probably also non-natives. And what happens, our beehives, we take honey off during the winter. When most people are putting out sugar water, we have such a diversity of plants that are flowering 12 months of the year that we have bees on warm days are going out and working flowers and making more honey. That is the exact opposite of most beekeepers, even in our area, who have to go out and put sugar water out in case the bees are active during the winter because there's not something for those bees to work. Now, honeybees are not native, but it's using honeybees as a, you know, as a substitute for our native pollinators, which do the same thing. We can see our native pollinators out all winter as things are flowering. You know, I keep saying conserve natural areas. You know, I'd love for some work to be done on the correlation between exotic species occurrence and their distance from roads or developed sites. Because in my experience as an avid outdoors person, you see those exotic species very close to roads. But once you get deeper in the woods, you don't see so many exotic species. Now, again, I'm talking in general. I'm not talking about I'm not saying there are no bad plants. I'm just talking about taking a step back and looking at the larger picture. One of those at that invasives council, there was a land manager who talked to me, and land manager is that means somebody who does logging. And he said miscanthus is terrible. As soon as we finish up with the site, next thing you know, it's all miscanthus growing through there. Well, I look at that and I think, okay, I've been at logged sites. You've just logged everything. And this is in the western part of the state. So it's all sloped. You've you've torn the ground all up with skid steers, you've trucks, and you've cut all the trees. Maybe that miscanthus that comes in there is holding some soil there. Maybe it's doing a good thing. And if you're a gardener, do you ever plant miscanthus in the shade? No, it is shade intolerant. It will die in the shade. So once that area grows back up, assuming it is, either replanted or allowed to regrow for future logging, that miscanthus is all going to die out in there. But in between, it might be doing a good thing by holding that land. And that's what I'm saying about look at the positive and the negative and have a realistic assessment of what the good, the bad. So where do we go? In 100 years, Central North Carolina is going to have a climate similar to North Florida. The plants that grow here are not going to be the same plants that were growing here 250 years ago, 500 years ago. They're going to be different plants. We can try not to let these other plants come in from up south, move from the south or from other parts of the world, but we're not going to do that. And if we try to keep all the plants that were here when white people first got here, they're going to die out. A lot of them will not tolerate the conditions of North Florida. So trying to restore or keep ecosystems at what is really an arbitrary historic state when we white people first saw them, it's not going to happen, especially with how much we continue to improve our environment. So where I want you to leave you is stop looking at the native versus non-native in terms of invasion biology. We have to keep them out. We have to keep them out. We have to eradicate what's here. It's an invasion. That is not going to be sustainable. It isn't sustainable now. What we need to do is start looking at conservation biology in terms of a conciliation biology, which is more sustainable, reality-driven science, where we look at what is the positive, what is the negative, where do we want to spend dollars and effort to eradicate something and keep it from coming, versus where do we look at it and say, all things considered, this is not harming a lot, and it may be helping more than it's harming. It's working in those gray areas. That's the key. We don't look at the gray areas. We look at this native versus non-native as black versus white, as good versus bad. And even if you feel that way, it's not a practical way to solve our issues. So I think I have some things in the chat. Let me see. butterfly. So recently attended class on native plants in which the presenter stated that butterfly bush is toxic to Lepidoptera. When asked if she meant it was not a host plant or digestible, she insisted that it is toxic to Lepidoptera in general. What does research show? Absolutely not. That's crazy. When I see rampant Asian bittersweet overtaking natural areas and literally straining trees, should I say to myself, not a problem, nothing should be done? No, what you do in that situation is you look at positives versus negatives. There are big negatives with bittersweet. What I would say is look at one, why it is there, and two, what is an effective way of managing it. Bittersweet isn't as big a problem here. It's not something I have, but you know, what does it have any positives? I don't know. Certainly wouldn't be something that we would bring in.
What would be a successful management? Are you familiar with anything?
No, it's not been something I've really had to deal with. I mean, I don't know beyond chemical management of it, what real recourse there is.
Okay.
So what is your take on natural fauna collapse? Are insect and bird populations collapsing? If they are, is that a problem, and should anything be done? So, you know, the jury's still out on some of that. There are certainly some serious issues there. I would say my feeling related to this is it is more a case of overuse of chemicals, of habitat fragmentation, of decreased diversity in our landscapes. If you go to nurseries and you say, I'm only going to plant native plants, you are going to have a very, very limited plant palette of plants. A friend of mine who is a big advocate, who was one of the people who started Culloway Native Plant Conference, but he has also worked in the more traditional horticultural field, but he is passionate about native plants. He will say to you, when you start talking about business, he'll say, well, you know, a lot of the folks that came to that first Culloway conference we have on native plants, a lot of the nurserymen who were growing native plants who went there are driving the same truck now 25 years later. You know, it's from a business point of view, it's hard to grow a lot of them. So it's hard to find a lot of native plants, and it decreases the diversity that's out there. We are better off not looking at a plant saying, is it a good pollinator plant? Is it a good insect plant? Is it a good bird plant? And saying, I don't need a plant. I need 20 different plants. Or I don't need 20 plants. I need 50 different plants, because so many of our pollinators we don't notice. They're little small flies, they're beetles. There are other things out there than the butterflies, which are terrible pollinators, and other plants, and we don't know what all we're servicing plants with. Some of our plants that get the most native pollinators on them are exotic plants that have the small flowers with a relatively short tube with a white corolla that mimics what a lot of our native plants have that serve those pollinators. But when I see these lists of plants for pollinator gardens, it kills me, because right there you are limiting it to almost always to insects that are active and pollinating during spring and summer. And we need things that will work for pollinators all winter. And we're going to need it more and more as our climate becomes more and more like North Florida. If those those populations are collapsing, yes, things should be done. But again, I think it's better to be done with thinking about diversity. Do we know if people coming over the Bering Bridge brought non-natives with them? Seems like me. Yes, well, not just people. I mean, remember that over that Bering Strait, that land bridge, it wasn't just people coming. This was massive areas where people were moved. And animals and birds and all kinds of things could move. And there's some fascinating research from an NC State researcher, Jenny Jang, which I'm just now digesting. It is way over my head, and I wanted to get it into this talk, but just couldn't get it my head wrapped around it enough to really put it in here. But one of the things she shows in the biogeography of Cornus is you can really follow the DNA and see that Cornus came over from Asia, went down the East Coast into Mexico and up along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. And what is Cornus, Florida today came via that route. Whether that came directly with the people, they moved it themselves, or it just came along with the animals that were also moving with them, along with people. But certainly people have moved plants forever. You know, one time somebody asked me where peppers were native to, and I said, well, that's Mexico and Central America. And they said, well, what about, you know, but it's part of traditional ethnic, you know, culinary, you know, traditions in all over Asia and Thailand and all these places. I'm like, you're right. Does it come from all the? No, it comes from you know, Mexico, but it's moved so far that if you were to tell somebody in much of Asia that they had to cook without hot peppers because they weren't native, you know, they would think you're crazy. And it's a part of the flora there now. They do grow and pop up around there. Yeah, so he makes a comment, look to Blue Ridge Prism for invasive species control. I don't know what that is, but I will second that. Sounds like somebody knows what they're talking about, and I love all things Blue Ridge. So please ask questions if you want. You can throw tomatoes at me. I didn't have any thrown at me by the Invasives Council.
How do you feel about biocontrol, introducing, you know, like predatory insects to control plants, invasive plants?
You know, I had a book when I was a kid where, you know, this kingdom had all kinds of mice, and so they brought in cats, and then the cats were a problem. They brought in dogs. The dogs were problems. They brought in, they all went all the way up to elephants, and then had to bring mice in to scare the elephants off eventually. You know, that's above my pay grade. It's certainly a potentially scary, you know, thing. You know, the science would have to be well and truly behind bringing in insects to deal with plant issues, especially. And I do believe that they can.
Mark,
Yep.
so one of my concerns with planting all these white oaks, especially in our area, I don't know how it is down in North Carolina, is bacterial leaf scorch, which I had a tree in my yard that had bacterial leaf scorch. The oaks across the street, there are 3 of them with bacterial leaf scorch. If I walk down the block, I know I'm going to see another 3 because of the humidity rising, because of the rain patterns changing. I mean, if you diversify, if you plant all different plants, including from Asia, including from Europe, doesn't that make what we have stronger rather than if you just keep planting white oaks, you're going to have the same problem we had when we had elms everywhere.
Right. Look at ashes in the Midwest where it was the predominant tree, and they're gone now. You know, and you're right. And I'll take, you know, rose rosette was not brought in to deal with multiflora rose to get rid of multiflora rose. That's not the case. Rose rosette, not sure exactly when it came in, but it was documented over 100 years ago on multiflora rose, and it was never a problem. It would be on some multiflora rose, and that was it. Now it's spread by a mite that floats in the wind. What happened was knockout rose was introduced, and knockout rose in many ways was a perfect landscape plant. It was a rose, and people love roses. You didn't have to prune it. It would grow into a beautiful shape, had gorgeous foliage. If it was mild enough winter, it would be evergreen with gorgeous foliage. Didn't get all those rose diseases. flower for ages and ages and ages. If you were the type of person who insisted on pruning everything, you could whack it back to the ground, you could shear it, you could cut it into cubes if you wanted. It was the ideal landscape plant. And it was a rose. So it was planted in everybody's yards. It was planted by the dozens and hundreds in front of, you know, all kinds of commercial place. It was planted by the thousands at the NC State Fairgrounds because it looked beautiful for during October State Fair. It was planted everywhere. Now, all of a sudden, that mite that was on that multiflora rose that drifted in the wind and would you always before just fall on the ground or on another multiflora rose on a hedgerow and not be a problem. Now, all of a sudden, it can move from host to host to host to host because lack of diversity. We all planted all these knockout roses and allowed that population to just explode. Insect problems are just like diseases. You need susceptible host, pathogen, and a conducive environment. We didn't have enough hosts when we didn't have that knockout rose, but once everybody had a knockout rose, we had all these hosts. So it was like jamming everybody with a cold into the same room with a bunch of 100-year-olds on, you know, oxygen and expecting nobody to get sick and die from that. That's what happened. Is we just had too many hosts. Yeah, you know, all these things, you know, the stink bugs that, you know, most things, all our dogwoods were going to die. Now there were some terrible losses of dogwoods with Disculanthracnose, but they haven't all disappeared. You know, a lot of them have died in our landscapes because they're stressed in our landscapes, have died because of this. But yeah, it really is true that the more diversity we plant, the more we're going to save the other plants. You know, if we start all planting native plants, if that's all mandated, we're all planting native plants everywhere, it's going to be like lightning when something comes, because the way we are and the way this is work is they're going to produce the things that are easiest to produce, that are the showiest and toughest that people want, just like that knockout rose. So we're going to find the best dogwood that'll live everywhere. And we're going to plant 60 bazillion of them. And then all our dogwoods out in the woods and in our landscapes are going to die because it's going to go through like wildfire. That's why I'm always talking about diversity, 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 that being the key.
Okay. I think we've about run out of time, or we're getting close to it, and I don't want to run past. I set it up until 8 o'clock, thinking that we'd have. But anyway,
I'm thinking I'd be 20 minutes late.
Yeah, right. But Mark, thank you so much for these great ideas and your explanations and so forth this evening.
Pleasure.
And if you would hit the stop recording button, and I don't know if you want to hand it back to me as host, but